The knock on the door came at midnight, and Alara Whitmore knew before she opened it that her family's world was about to end. Mr. Grimshaw stood on the step with two men behind him, holding lanterns and a stack of papers tied with string. He did not wait to be invited in. He walked past Alara into the small sitting room, where her mother, Margaret, sat frozen beside the fire, and he dropped the papers on the table with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. "Your husband owed me £4,000, he said to Margaret. "He is dead." "The debt is not." Margaret's hands shook as she reached for the papers. Alara stood in the doorway, her heart pounding, watching the color drain from her mother's face as she read the numbers written there. £4,000. It was more money than the family had seen in 10 years combined. Her father had kept the truth from them until the very end, smiling at supper, promising that everything was fine, while behind closed doors, he lost everything at the card tables of men far more ruthless than himself. "We have nothing," Margaret whispered. "You know we have nothing." "I know you have this house," Grimshaw said. "And I know you have a son who is not yet 12 years old, who will need food and a roof over his head for many years to come. And I know," he added, his eyes moving to Alara for the first time, "that you have a daughter of marrying age." Alara felt the room tilt beneath her. She had heard rumors about Grimshaw, about the way he collected debts, not with violence, but with something colder, with arrangements, with contracts, with lives traded like property. She stepped forward before her mother could speak. "What do you mean by that?" Grimshaw studied her, the way a merchant studies a bolt of cloth, deciding its worth. "There is a man," he said slowly, "who owes me a favor, and who has expressed, more than once, a wish to marry again. He is a duke, wealthy beyond anything your family has ever known. If you marry him, this debt disappears. Your mother keeps this house. Your brother keeps his future. And you," he added, "keep your family from ruin. And if I refuse, then I take the house within the week, and your mother and brother will be on the street by winter." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Alara had ever heard. She looked at her mother, whose eyes were wet, but who said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She looked toward the small room upstairs, where her brother, Oliver, was sleeping, unaware that his entire future was being decided in the room below him. And she thought, briefly and painfully, of Edmund Hale, the young lawyer's clerk she had loved since she was 16, the man she had quietly promised herself to, the man she had imagined a small, ordinary, happy life with. That life was gone now. It had died the moment Grimshaw walked through the door. "Who is this duke?" she asked, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her did. "Ashford Blackwood," Grimshaw said, "Duke of Ravensworth. Perhaps you have heard the name." Alara had heard it. Everyone had heard it. Duke Ashford Blackwood was spoken of in hushed voices at every gathering she had ever attended, though she herself had never met him. He was known for two things: his enormous wealth and the mysterious death of his first wife 3 years ago, a death that had never been fully explained, and that had left him with a reputation so cold that mothers warned their daughters away from him at dances, even as they secretly wished their daughters might catch his eye for the sake of his fortune. "They say he is cruel," Alara said quietly. "They say many things," Grimshaw replied. "I only care what the contract says. Marry him, and your family is safe. That is all that matters tonight." Margaret finally spoke, her voice breaking. "Alara, you do not have to." "I do," Alara said, cutting her off gently. "You know I do." She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window in her small room, looking out at the dark shape of the garden her father used to walk in before everything fell apart, and she allowed herself exactly 1 hour to grieve for the life she had planned, the cottage with Edmund, the quiet mornings, the children they had once imagined together in hushed, hopeful conversations. Then she folded that grief away, the way she had learned to fold away so many things since her father's death, and she made her decision final in her own heart, long before she said it aloud to anyone else. In the morning, she wrote a letter to Edmund. It was the hardest letter she had ever written, and she tore up 4 attempts before she managed one that did not reveal the truth. She could not tell him about Grimshaw, about the debt, about the marriage that was about to swallow her whole life. If he knew, he would try to stop it, and there was no version of that fight where her family survived. So she told him instead that she had changed her mind, that she did not love him the way she once believed she did, that he should not wait for her and should not try to find her. She sealed it with hands that trembled the entire time, and she gave it to a servant to deliver before she could change her mind. She did not see his reaction. She told herself that was a mercy, though it did not feel like one. 3 days later, Grimshaw returned with a formal letter bearing a wax seal she did not recognize, a raven, with its wings spread, pressed into black wax. It was from Blackwood Manor itself, a short and businesslike note stating that the Duke agreed to the arrangement, that the wedding would take place within the month, and that the debt would be considered settled the moment the marriage was recorded. There was no warmth in the words. There was no curiosity about the woman he was agreeing to marry. It read like a transaction because, to him, it clearly was one. Alara read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, beside the torn drafts of the letter she had sent to Edmund. She noticed, distantly, that her hands were no longer shaking. There was a strange kind of calm that came after a decision had truly been made, after there was no longer any question of what would happen next, only the long list of things that had to be done to get there. Her mother tried, in the days that followed, to speak with her about it, to ask if she was certain, to offer to find another way. Though both of them knew there was no other way. Alara answered these attempts kindly but briefly, always turning the conversation toward practical matters instead. What dress she should be married in. What few belongings she would bring with her to Blackwood Manor. Whether Oliver's school fees would truly be paid on time now that the debt was settled. She found it easier to survive inside the details than inside the feelings, and so she filled her days with details until there was no room left for anything else. Oliver, 12 years old, and still too young to understand the full shape of what was happening, only knew that his sister was getting married to a very rich man, and that this meant good things for the family. He asked her, one evening, if the Duke was kind.
"I don't know," Alara admitted.
"I have never met him." "Then how do you know you want to marry him?" She smiled at her little brother, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, the way she had done since he was small enough to be carried. "Sometimes," she said, "we do things not because we want to, but because they need to be done. And sometimes, doing what needs to be done is its own kind of love." Oliver did not fully understand this answer, but he nodded anyway, satisfied enough by his sister's calm tone, and Alara was grateful that at least one member of her family could still sleep easily at night. She herself slept less and less as the wedding date approached. She lay awake going over everything she had heard about Duke Ashford Blackwood, the stories that came from servants who had once worked at Blackwood Manor and left within months, the whispers about his temper, the way his first wife had died so suddenly and so quietly that no one outside the family truly knew the cause. Some said illness. Some said something darker. Alara did not know which version to believe, and she told herself it did not matter. She was not marrying him for love, and she was not marrying him to uncover his secrets. She was marrying him to save her family, and whatever kind of man waited for her at Blackwood Manor, she intended to survive him. 2 weeks before the wedding, she was permitted a single meeting with her future husband, arranged formally through letters between households, as though they were negotiating a treaty rather than a marriage. She dressed carefully that morning, though she was not sure why it mattered, and she was taken by carriage to a townhouse the Duke kept in the city for such occasions. He was already waiting when she arrived, standing near the window with his back partly turned, and her first impression of him was simply of stillness, the way he stood, as though he had trained himself never to show what he was thinking. When he turned to face her, she saw a man perhaps 10 years older than herself, with dark hair, sharp features, and eyes that studied her, with a coldness that felt almost clinical, as though he were assessing a business arrangement rather than meeting the woman he was about to marry. "Lady Whitmore," he said, and his voice was low and even. "I trust the terms were made clear to you." "They were," Alara said, holding his gaze, though everything in her wanted to look away. "Then you understand. This marriage exists for practical reasons. I have no interest in pretending otherwise, and I would ask the same honesty from you." "You will have it," Alara said. "I am not marrying you for affection, Your Grace. I am marrying you to protect my family. I see no reason to pretend that is anything other than the truth." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, though it was gone before she could be certain. She wondered if he had expected her to weep, or to plead, or to attempt some show of romantic feeling to soften him. She offered him none of that, and in the silence that followed, she felt she had, in some small way, taken back a piece of control in a situation where she otherwise had none. "Very well," he said finally. "The wedding will proceed as planned. I will send a carriage for you the week before, so you may settle into the manor ahead of the ceremony." "Thank you," Elara said, though there was little warmth in either the offer or the reply. He studied her a moment longer, as though trying to solve a puzzle he did not particularly care to solve, and then he inclined his head in a small, formal gesture and excused himself from the room, leaving Elara alone with the cold weight of what she had just agreed to. On the carriage ride home, she allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not loudly, not for long, but enough to release some of the pressure that had been building in her chest since the night Grimshaw first knocked on their door. She cried for Edmund, who likely believed by now that she had simply stopped loving him. She cried for the ordinary life she would never have. And she cried, quietly, for herself, for the version of Elara Whitmore who had once believed love would be part of her future, and who now understood that some sacrifices could not be undone, only carried. By the time the carriage reached her home, she had wiped her face clean and arranged her expression into something calm and steady, because her mother and brother were waiting at the door, and they needed to see a woman who was certain, not one who was afraid. She stepped down from the carriage with her chin lifted, and she walked toward the house that her sacrifice was about to save, carrying inside her a secret grief that no one, not her family, and certainly not the Duke she was about to marry, would ever be allowed to see. The wedding was 1 week away, and Elara Whitmore had already decided that whatever waited for her at Blackwood Manor, she would face it the same way she had faced everything since her father's death, quietly, completely alone, and without ever letting anyone know the true price of what she had given. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and quiet, and Elara stood in front of the small mirror in her room, while a maid fastened the buttons of a dress that had once belonged to her mother. There was no excitement in the house, only a careful, practiced calm, as though everyone had agreed silently not to speak of what this day truly was. Margaret came in as the final buttons were fastened, and for a long moment, she simply looked at her daughter, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. "You look beautiful," she said. "Thank you," Elara said, though the word felt strange in her mouth, on a day that held so little joy. "I wish there was another way," Margaret whispered. "There isn't," Elara said gently. "And even if there were, Mother, I would still choose this. Oliver deserves his future. You deserve your home. I would not trade those things for anything, not even for my own happiness." Margaret pulled her into an embrace, careful not to wrinkle the dress, and for a moment, Elara allowed herself to simply be held, to be her mother's daughter, rather than a bride about to marry a stranger. Then the carriage arrived outside, and the moment passed, as all moments eventually did. The ceremony itself was small and quiet, held in a private chapel attached to Blackwood Manor, rather than in a grand cathedral filled with guests. Elara supposed this was intentional. The Duke had no interest in a public spectacle, and perhaps did not wish to invite the kind of gossip that a large society wedding would bring. Only a handful of witnesses were present. Her mother and brother sat on one side. On the other sat a few members of the Duke's household staff, and a stern-faced older woman, Elara would later learn was his aunt, Lady Prudence, who watched the entire ceremony with an expression that gave away nothing at all. Duke Ashford Blackwood stood at the altar in dark, formal clothing, his face composed into the same unreadable stillness she remembered from their first meeting. When Elara walked toward him, he did not smile. He did not offer any small gesture of warmth. He simply watched her approach the way one might watch the final stage of an agreement being signed. And Elara found, strangely, that she was grateful for his honesty. There was no performance here, no pretending. Whatever this marriage was, at least it was clear about what it was not. The priest spoke the words of the ceremony in a calm, practiced voice, and Elara answered when she was meant to answer, her voice steady, even as her heart beat hard enough that she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. When it came time for the Duke to speak his vows, his voice was low and even, containing not a trace of feeling beyond simple duty. Elara wondered, briefly, if he had spoken these same words to another woman 3 years earlier, and whether he had meant them then, before whatever tragedy had hardened him into the man standing before her now. She pushed the thought away. It was not her business, not yet, and perhaps not ever. When the ceremony ended and they were pronounced husband and wife, the Duke turned to her and, for the briefest moment, their eyes met properly for the first time all day. There was no warmth in his gaze, but there was something else, a kind of careful, guarded curiosity, as though he too was wondering exactly what he had agreed to. "Your Grace," Elara said quietly, the title feeling strange and heavy in her mouth. "Duchess," he replied, and the word seemed to cost him something to say, though she could not have guessed what. There was no celebration afterward, no dinner filled with laughter and toasts. Instead, there was a brief and formal meal attended only by the small group who had witnessed the ceremony. Conversation kept to polite, empty topics that skirted around the truth everyone in the room understood: that this marriage had been built entirely on necessity, not affection. Lady Prudence, seated across from Elara, studied her throughout the meal with sharp, assessing eyes. "You are very calm for a new bride," she said finally. "I have had time to prepare myself," Elara answered carefully. "Prepare yourself for what, exactly?" Elara met the older woman's gaze without flinching. "For whatever this marriage requires of me." Something shifted in Lady Prudence's expression, not quite approval, but perhaps a grudging respect. She said nothing further on the matter, though Elara caught her studying her again several more times throughout the meal, as though trying to determine whether the calm was genuine or simply well performed. When the meal ended, Oliver hugged Elara tightly, whispering that he would miss her, and Margaret held her for a long moment, both of them fighting to keep their composure in front of the small gathered crowd. Then the carriage that would take her mother and brother home was called, and Elara watched from the manor steps as the only family she had ever known disappeared down the long drive, leaving her alone, in a place that did not yet feel like anything close to home. The Duke appeared beside her once the carriage was out of sight, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable as always. "You will be shown to your rooms," he said. "Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, will see that you have everything you need." "Thank you," Elara said. He studied her a moment longer, as though there was something else he intended to say, but whatever it was, he seemed to decide against it. "I have matters to attend to," he said instead, and without further explanation, he turned and walked back into the manor, leaving Elara standing alone on the steps of her new home. She did not cry. She had promised herself, on the carriage ride home from their first meeting, that she would allow herself exactly one moment of grief for the life she had lost, and she had already spent that moment. Now there was only the practical business of surviving what came next, and Elara intended to survive it with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every difficult moment since her father's death. Mrs. Dalton, a kind-faced woman perhaps 50 years old, appeared a moment later to guide her inside. She was polite, efficient, and careful in her manner, the way a servant learns to be careful in a household where the master's moods are unpredictable. As they walked through the long, echoing halls of Blackwood Manor, Elara noticed the portraits lining the walls, generations of Blackwood ancestors staring down at her, with expressions that ranged from proud to severe, none of them warm. "How long have you worked here, Mrs. Dalton?" Elara asked, hoping to fill the silence with something other than her own uncertain thoughts. "Nearly 20 years, my lady. Duchess, I should say. Forgive me. It will take some time to adjust." "There is no need to apologize. I imagine there is a great deal for both of us to adjust to." Mrs. Dalton's expression softened slightly. "The manor has been quiet these past few years," she said carefully. "It will be good to have some life in it again." "What was she like?" Elara asked before she could stop herself. "The first Duchess." Mrs. Dalton's expression closed slightly, the way a door closes when someone remembers it should not be left open. "That is not my story to tell, Duchess. Perhaps in time, His Grace will share what he wishes you to know." Elara did not press further, though the question lingered in her mind, long after Mrs. Dalton had shown her to a large, elegant set of rooms overlooking the eastern gardens. The rooms were beautiful, filled with fine furniture and soft light, but they felt untouched, almost unused, as though no one had truly lived in them for a very long time. "These were prepared specially for you," Mrs. Dalton explained. "His Grace gave instructions that you should have your own rooms, separate from his." Elara noted this without surprise. It confirmed what she had already understood, that this marriage would be one of separate lives, sharing a single roof, nothing more. She thanked Mrs. Dalton and, once she was finally alone, sat by the window overlooking the gardens and allowed herself a long, quiet breath, the first true moment of stillness she had experienced since the night Grimshaw had knocked on her family's door. She thought of her mother and brother, likely arriving home by now, safe in a house that would remain theirs because of the choice she had made. She thought, briefly, of Edmund, and hoped he had found some way to move forward, to build the life she could no longer share with him. And she thought, finally, of the man she had married, a stranger with cold eyes and a guarded heart, whose first wife had died under circumstances no one seemed willing to discuss. Whatever waited for her in this marriage, Ilara decided, she would face it the way she faced everything now, quietly, carefully, and completely on her own terms, even if her husband never knew the true cost of the woman standing beside him. That evening, she did not see the Duke again. She dined alone in her rooms, attended by a quiet young maid named Lucy, who seemed eager to please, but careful not to speak too freely. Ilara asked her gentle questions throughout the meal, about the household, about the daily routines of the manor, about anything that might help her understand the world she had just entered. And Lucy answered what she could, though she too grew quiet whenever the conversation drifted too close to the subject of the first Duchess. As night fell, and the manor grew silent around her, Ilara lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the sounds of a house she did not yet know, the creak of old wood settling, the distant call of an owl somewhere in the gardens, the faint, steady rhythm of a clock ticking somewhere down the hall. She was a duchess now, married to one of the wealthiest men in the country, living in a manor grand enough to house 100 families, and yet she had never felt more alone in her entire life. She closed her eyes and thought of her brother's future, secured, her mother's home, saved. And she told herself, as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, that whatever loneliness this marriage brought her, it was a price worth paying for the people she loved most in the world. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of surviving her new life at Blackwood Manor. Tonight, for just a little while longer, she allowed herself to simply exist inside the quiet, aching weight of everything she had given up to get here. Ilara woke on her first full morning at Blackwood Manor, to the sound of rain against her window, and for a moment, still caught between sleep and waking, she forgot where she was. Then the unfamiliar shape of the room settled around her, and the memory of the day before returned all at once. The wedding, the empty ceremony, the husband who had barely spoken to her since. She rose slowly, dressed with the help of Lucy, and made her way downstairs to explore the house that was now, in name at least, her own. The manor was even larger than it had seemed the day before. Corridor after corridor stretched out in every direction, lined with closed doors and old portraits, the entire structure seeming to swallow sound the way a held breath swallows silence. Ilara passed several servants along the way, each of them offering a polite but careful greeting before hurrying on with their duties, none of them lingering long enough for conversation. She found the library by accident, drawn in by the smell of old paper and leather, and spent nearly an hour simply walking along the shelves, running her fingers over the spines of books that had clearly not been touched in years. It was the first room in the manor that felt, to her, less like a monument to wealth, and more like a place someone might actually wish to spend time in. "You read, then?" The voice startled her, and she turned to find Duke Ashford standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with the same careful, unreadable expression he seemed to wear at all times. "I do," Ilara said, straightening slightly. "I hope that is not a problem." "It is not," he said. "This library has gone unused for some time. It is good to see it serve its purpose again." It was, she realized, the closest thing to a kind statement he had offered her since they met. She waited to see if he would say more, but he simply studied her a moment longer, his eyes moving briefly to the book in her hands, before he spoke again. "I have business in the village this morning. Mrs. Dalton will show you the rest of the house, should you wish it. I trust you will find everything you need." "Thank you, Your Grace." He paused at the mention of the title, something flickering briefly across his face, though it was gone before Ilara could name it. "Ashford," he said finally. "There is no need for such formality between us, given our arrangement." "Ashford, then," Ilara said, testing the name carefully. "You may call me Ilara." He nodded once, and for a moment, something almost like understanding passed between them. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that whatever this marriage was, they would both need to find some way to exist within it. Then he turned and left, his footsteps fading down the long corridor, and Alara was alone again, with the quiet company of 1,000 old books. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm. Ashford spent much of his time away from the manor, attending to business matters that were never fully explained to her, while Alara occupied herself with the slow work of learning the household, the names of the staff, the routines of the kitchen, the particular creak of the third stair that always seemed to announce her presence before she arrived anywhere. She found, to her quiet surprise, that she did not entirely mind the solitude. It gave her time to write letters home, to plan carefully how she might continue supporting her mother and brother, without drawing attention to the amounts she was sending, and to simply breathe after months of constant fear and uncertainty. It was nearly 2 weeks into her new life when she first encountered Tommy, a stable boy no older than 14, sitting alone near the edge of the gardens with his arm wrapped tightly against his chest, his face pale with pain he was clearly trying to hide. "What happened to you?" Alara asked, kneeling beside him, despite the fine fabric of her dress. "It's nothing, Duchess. I fell, is all. I'll be right in a moment." "Let me see." Tommy hesitated, clearly unused to anyone of her position taking an interest in his troubles, but eventually allowed her to examine the arm, which was swollen and clearly injured badly enough to need proper attention. "This needs a doctor," Alara said firmly. "Mr. Pruitt won't allow it," Tommy said quietly. "Says it's a waste of coin for a stable boy's arm." Alara felt something sharpen inside her. Not quite anger, but close to it. "Who is Mr. Pruitt?" "The steward, Duchess. He manages the household accounts and the staff wages." Alara did not know Mr. Pruitt yet, having only glimpsed him once or twice from a distance, but she resolved in that moment that she would meet him properly, and soon. She helped Tommy to his feet and walked with him to the kitchen, instructing the cook to send for the village doctor immediately. And when the cook hesitated, clearly uncertain whether the Duchess had the authority to give such an order, Alara simply said, "I will speak with His Grace myself, if there is any question about payment. This boy needs care, and he will have it." The doctor arrived within the hour, confirmed the arm was broken, and set it properly, and Alara sat with Tommy throughout the process, offering quiet words of comfort as the doctor worked. It was a small thing, in the grand scale of the world, but it was the first time since her wedding that she had felt like herself again, capable, useful, able to make a genuine difference in someone's life, rather than simply surviving her own circumstances. Word of the incident reached Ashford before she had the chance to mention it herself. He found her that evening in the small sitting room near her chambers, his expression harder to read than usual. "I understand you overruled my steward today," he said without preamble. "I did," Alara said, meeting his gaze steadily. "A boy was badly injured, and your steward decided his wages were worth more than his arm. I did not think that was a decision that should stand. Mr. Pruitt has managed this household's finances for 15 years. Then perhaps it is time someone reminded him that the people working in this household are not merely line items in his accounts." Ashford studied her for a long moment, and Alara braced herself for anger, for the cold cruelty she had been warned about before her wedding. Instead, something unexpected happened. The faintest suggestion of amusement crossed his features, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" "A woman who married me, for my title and my money, and who would spend her days concerned only with her own comfort. I did marry you for practical reasons," Alara said honestly, "but that does not mean I intend to spend my life here concerned only with myself." Ashford was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she could not fully name. "Mr. Pruitt will be instructed that medical care for the staff is not to be denied on the basis of cost," he said finally. "You were right to intervene." It was, Alara realized with quiet surprise, the first true agreement they had reached since the wedding. A small moment of shared understanding between two people who had otherwise existed as near strangers beneath the same roof. She did not know what to make of it, only that it felt, in some small way, like the first crack in the ice that had surrounded her husband since the day she arrived. Over the following days, she noticed Ashford watching her more closely. though he said little about it directly. He seemed to be studying her the way one studies an unfamiliar language, trying to understand a woman who did not behave the way he had expected a wife of convenience to behave. She continued her quiet work around the manor, checking on Tommy's recovery, learning the names of every servant she encountered, gently but firmly correcting small injustices where she found them, and slowly, without either of them quite acknowledging it, the distance between them began to shift. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was no longer quite the cold, empty silence of their wedding day either, and Ilara found herself wondering, for the first time since Grimshaw had knocked on her family's door, whether this marriage might one day become something more than a simple arrangement born of necessity, though she quickly reminded herself not to hope for too much, too soon. She had already lost one future to circumstance. She would not allow herself to build another one on foundations that might not hold. Still, that night, as she sat by her window watching the rain finally clear from the darkened gardens below, she allowed herself a small, careful thought, that perhaps Duke Ashford Blackwood was not entirely the cold, cruel man his reputation suggested, and that perhaps, in time, they might find some way to exist together that was more than mere survival. It was a small hope, fragile and uncertain, but it was the first hope she had allowed herself since the night her old life had ended, and Ilara held onto it carefully, unwilling yet to say it aloud, even to herself. A month into her marriage, Ilara found herself standing outside the door of her husband's study, holding a small pouch of coins that should not have existed if anyone were paying close attention to her monthly allowance. She had been careful, she thought, selling small pieces of jewelry through a discreet merchant in the village, rather than the city, keeping her transactions quiet and infrequent. But careful was not the same as invisible, and she was about to learn that Ashford Blackwood noticed far more than he let on. "You wish to see me?" she asked, stepping into the study when he called for her to enter. Ashford sat behind a large wooden desk, covered in papers, and when he looked up at her, his expression carried none of the small, careful warmth that had begun to show itself over the past weeks. This was the cold, unreadable man she had first met, and Ilara felt her stomach tighten in response. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She sat, keeping her posture straight, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I have received a report," Ashford said slowly, "that you have been selling pieces of jewelry through a merchant in the village. Jewelry that belonged, before our marriage, to your own family, and jewelry that I gave you as gifts after our wedding." Ilara kept her expression carefully neutral, though her heart had begun to pound. "That is true," she admitted, seeing no benefit in denying it. "Why?" "I have my reasons." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one I intend to give," Ilara said, meeting his gaze steadily, despite the tension building in the room. Ashford leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she refused to give him the satisfaction. "I have given this marriage a great deal of thought," he said. "I assumed, when we agreed to these terms, that you had no debts of your own, no hidden obligations. If I am wrong about that, I would rather know now than discover it later, in circumstances far less convenient." "You are not wrong," Ilara said carefully. "I have no debts of my own." "Then explain to me why my wife is quietly selling jewelry to a village merchant, rather than simply asking me for whatever funds she requires." Ilara hesitated, caught between the truth and the careful walls she had built to protect it. She had promised herself, since the very beginning of this arrangement, that she would never allow Ashford to see her as an object of pity, never allow him to believe she had married him purely out of desperation, rather than a genuine willingness to fulfill her role as his wife. If she told him the truth now, that she was sending money home to keep her mother and brother afloat, that every allowance he gave her was quietly redirected to a family she had sacrificed everything to protect, she feared it would only confirm what he likely already suspected, that she was nothing more than a poor relation who had married for money, however she tried to frame it otherwise. "It is a private matter," she said finally. "It does not concern the running of this household, and it does not affect my duties as your wife." "Everything that happens within these walls concerns me," Ashford said, his voice sharpening slightly. "Then perhaps you should trust that I am capable of managing my own private affairs without your oversight." The words came out sharper than she intended, and for a moment, silence stretched thick and heavy between them. Ashford's jaw tightened, and Alara braced herself for the anger she had been warned about before her wedding, the cruelty that had made his name notorious throughout the county. Instead, he simply studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "Very well," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "I will not press the matter further today. But understand this, Alara. I have been deceived before, by someone I trusted far more than I currently trust you. I will not allow that to happen again, regardless of how careful the deception." The reference to his first wife hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Alara wanted, briefly, to ask him directly about what had happened, about the woman whose memory seemed to haunt every guarded word he spoke, but she held her tongue, understanding that this was neither the time nor the place, and that pressing him now would only deepen the distance that had briefly begun to close between them. "I am not her," Alara said quietly instead. "Whatever she did, whatever pain she caused you, I am not the same woman, and I will not be treated as though I am." Something shifted in Ashford's expression, not quite softening, but something close to it. "No," he said finally. "I am beginning to understand that you are not." She left the study a short while later, her heart still racing, though the confrontation had ended far more gently than she had feared. She returned to her rooms and sat by the window, turning the conversation over in her mind again and again, wondering how long she could continue keeping her secret before it finally came apart entirely. That evening, she wrote a careful letter to her mother, explaining that the funds would need to become slightly less frequent for a time, that she needed to be more cautious about how she managed things now that her husband had begun paying closer attention. She did not explain the full truth of the confrontation, not wishing to worry Margaret further, but she made clear that the family's needs remained her first priority, regardless of the risks involved. Days passed, and Ashford said nothing more on the subject, though Alara noticed a subtle change in his behavior toward her. A new watchfulness in the way his eyes followed her during meals. A new carefulness in the way he chose his words whenever they spoke. She could not tell if this was suspicion or something closer to genuine curiosity, and she found herself, despite everything, wishing it might eventually become the latter. It was nearly a week later that she encountered Lady Prudence in the manor's east garden, seated on a small stone bench beneath a blooming rose arbor, watching Alara approach with the same sharp, assessing eyes she had shown at the wedding. "You have caused quite a stir, Duchess," Lady Prudence said, as Alara took a seat beside her. "Have I?" Ashford does not typically concern himself with the private affairs of his household staff, let alone his wife. And yet I understand. He questioned you personally about some matter of jewelry. Alara kept her expression carefully neutral. "It was a small misunderstanding." "Was it?" Lady Prudence's sharp eyes studied her closely. "I have known my nephew a long time, Duchess. He does not concern himself with small misunderstandings. If he questioned you directly, it is because something about your behavior troubled him deeply enough to break his usual silence." "Perhaps he simply dislikes being kept in the dark," Alara said carefully. "Perhaps," Lady Prudence agreed, though her tone suggested she was not entirely satisfied with the answer. "I will tell you something, Duchess, that I have not told many. Ashford was not always the cold man you see now. Before his first marriage, he was warm, even generous with his affections. Whatever happened during that marriage changed him deeply, and he has spent the past 3 years building walls around himself that no one, myself included, has managed to fully break through." Alara considered this carefully. What happened to his first wife? Lady Prudence's expression closed slightly, the same way Mrs. Dalton's had when Alara first asked the same question weeks earlier. "That is not a story for me to tell," she said finally. "But I will say this. Whatever secrets you are keeping, Duchess, be careful how long you keep them. Ashford has been burned once, by a woman who hid the truth from him, until it was far too late to matter. I do not believe he will forgive a second betrayal quite so easily." The warning settled uneasily in Alara's chest, as she walked back toward the manor that evening, turning Lady Prudence's words over again and again in her mind. She understood the wisdom in the warning, understood that continuing to hide the truth about her family's circumstances carried real risk to whatever fragile trust she and Ashford had begun to build. And yet she could not bring herself to reveal the full truth. Not yet. Not while there remained even the smallest possibility that Ashford might see her as nothing more than another woman who had married him out of desperate need, rather than genuine willingness. She resolved, instead, to be more careful. She reduced the frequency of her jewelry sales, found quieter ways to redirect small portions of her allowance without drawing attention, and did her best to appear, in every visible way, like a duchess content with her circumstances and untroubled by any hidden burden. It was a careful, delicate balance, and Alara knew, even as she maintained it, that it could not last forever. Secrets, she had learned long before her marriage, had a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how carefully they were buried. She only hoped that when the truth finally came to light, it would not cost her everything she had worked so hard to protect. The truth about Ashford's first wife came to Alara not through him, but through an old letter she found quite by accident, tucked inside a book she had borrowed from the Manor's library, one quiet afternoon in early autumn. She had not been searching for anything in particular, only looking for something to occupy a rainy afternoon while Ashford attended to business in the village, when a folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages of an old volume of poetry and landed softly at her feet. She picked it up without thinking, and it was only once she unfolded it that she realized what she was holding. The handwriting was elegant, clearly a woman's, and the date at the top placed it nearly 4 years earlier, well before Ashford's first wife had died. Alara knew she should have folded it back up immediately and returned it to the shelf, unread, but curiosity, and perhaps something closer to a need to understand the man she had married, kept her eyes moving across the page. The letter was addressed to someone named Gerald, and its contents left little room for interpretation. It was a love letter, written by a woman signing herself only as Your C, filled with promises of a future together, complaints about a husband described as cold and consumed entirely by business, and plans for a meeting that would take place while that husband was away on matters of estate. Alara sat very still for a long moment, understanding at last what Lady Prudence and Mrs. Dalton had both been so careful never to say aloud. The first Duchess, Cecilia, she now understood, had not simply died under mysterious circumstances. She had betrayed her husband, likely for years, with a man named Gerald, and whatever had happened to end her life had happened in the shadow of that betrayal. She folded the letter carefully and sat with it for a long while, turning over everything she now understood about the man she had married. The coldness, the suspicion, the way he had questioned her so sharply about the jewelry, as though expecting to uncover some hidden deception of her own. It was not simply the general reputation of a cruel duke that had shaped him. It was the specific, personal wound of a wife who had smiled at him across the dinner table while secretly loving another man, who had likely made promises to him just as false as the ones she made to Gerald. Alara did not know what to do with the letter. She considered destroying it, considered pretending she had never found it at all. But something about the discovery had shifted her understanding of Ashford so deeply that she found herself, later that evening, unable to simply carry on, as though nothing had changed. She found him in his study, as she often did in the evenings, and for a long moment she simply stood in the doorway, watching him work by candlelight, his expression carrying the same careful stillness it always did. He looked up eventually, sensing her presence. "Alara, is something wrong?" "I found something today," she said carefully, "in the library. A letter." Something in his posture changed instantly, a stiffening, a wariness that told her he already understood what she meant before she said another word. "What letter?" "One written by Cecilia," Alara said gently, using the name for the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor. "I did not go looking for it, Ashford. It fell from a book I was reading. But I read it before I understood what it was, and I think it would be unfair of me to pretend otherwise." Ashford's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply staring at the papers on his desk, as though they might offer some escape from the conversation unfolding before him. "Then you know," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I know she was unfaithful to you," Alara said carefully. "I do not know the rest. I do not know how she died, or what truly happened between you in those final months, and I would not ask you to tell me, if it is too difficult. But I wanted you to know that I found the letter, rather than have you discover I was keeping it from you." Ashford was quiet for a long time, and Alara wondered if she had made a mistake in raising the subject at all. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and controlled. though she could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. Cecilia and I married for reasons not so different from our own arrangement, he said. Her family needed the connection to my title. I needed an heir, eventually, and a wife suitable to my position. We were not in love, but I believed, foolishly, that we might build something honest between us in time. He paused, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. Instead, I discovered, nearly 2 years into our marriage, that she had been carrying on an affair, almost since our wedding day. Gerald was the son of a neighboring landowner, a man I had once considered something close to a friend. When I confronted her, she did not deny it. She told me, quite plainly, that she had never loved me, and never intended to, and that she considered the marriage nothing more than a comfortable arrangement she saw no reason to honor beyond its practical benefits. And then? Ilara asked gently. And then, several months later, she fell ill quite suddenly. The physicians could not determine the cause with any certainty. Some said it was a weakness of the heart. Others suspected something in her blood. She died within a fortnight, and the rumors that followed, rumors I am certain you have heard some version of, suggested I had somehow caused her death, out of anger, or revenge for her betrayal. Did you? Ilara asked quietly, though she did not truly believe the answer would be yes. No, Ashford said, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to reach far deeper than simple exhaustion. I did not love her by the time she died, Ilara. I will not pretend otherwise. But I did not harm her, whatever the county gossips prefer to believe. I have carried the weight of that suspicion for 3 years now, unable to prove my innocence to people who have already decided my guilt, and unwilling to defend myself too loudly, for fear of appearing as though I have something to hide. Ilara studied him carefully, understanding now the source of every wall he had built since her arrival, not simply grief over a wife who had betrayed him, but the added burden of a reputation built on suspicion he could not disprove. I believe you, she said finally. Ashford looked at her then, truly looked at her, in a way he had not since the day of their wedding. Why? Because I have spent nearly 2 months in this household, Ilara said. I have watched how you treat your staff, how you handled the matter with Tommy's arm, how carefully you have spoken to me, even in moments of frustration. Whatever the county believes about you, Ashford, I do not believe you are a man capable of the cruelty they accuse you of. Something in his expression shifted then, a softening she had not seen before, quickly masked, but not quickly enough to escape her notice entirely. Thank you, he said quietly, for believing that. It has been some time since anyone has. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the letter still resting on the desk between them, and Ilara felt, for the first time since her wedding day, that some genuine understanding had begun to form between herself and the man she had married. Not love, not yet, but something honest, something built on truth rather than the careful performance they had both maintained since the beginning of their arrangement. Before she left the study that evening, Ashford spoke once more, his voice quieter than before. I would ask you not to speak of this to anyone else in the household. Lady Prudence knows some of it. Mrs. Dalton suspects more than she lets on. But I would rather the full truth remain between us, if you are willing to keep it so. I am, Ilara said, and she meant it completely. As she made her way back to her own chambers that night, Ilara found herself thinking not of Edmund, not of the family she was quietly supporting in secret, but of the man she had left behind in the study, a man carrying grief and suspicion in equal measure, who had, for the first time, allowed her to see past the careful walls he had built to protect himself. She did not yet know what this new understanding meant for their marriage, or whether it would change the careful distance that still existed between them in most other matters. But she understood, more clearly than ever, that Duke Ashford Blackwood was not the cold, cruel man his reputation suggested, and that whatever secrets still remained between them, they were, perhaps for the first time, beginning to build something real. The letter from her mother arrived on a cold morning in early winter, and Ilara knew from the very first line that something was terribly wrong. Oliver had fallen ill nearly a week earlier, Margaret wrote, a fever that had started small but had grown steadily worse, despite every remedy the village doctor could offer. The handwriting on the page was unsteady, clearly written by a woman fighting to keep her composure, and by the final lines, Margaret was pleading, not for comfort, but for money enough to bring in a physician from the city, someone with knowledge beyond what their small village doctor could provide. Alara read the letter 3 times before she allowed herself to feel the full weight of its meaning. Oliver, her sweet, 12-year-old brother, the boy whose future she had sacrificed everything to protect, was lying in a sickbed many miles away, and she was here, trapped within the walls of Blackwood Manor, unable to go to him without revealing the very secret she had worked so hard to protect. She had a small amount of money set aside from her careful, quiet arrangements over the past months, but she quickly calculated that it would not be nearly enough to cover the cost of a proper city physician, along with whatever medicines and care Oliver might require in the days ahead. She needed more, and she needed it quickly, and there was only one true source of wealth available to her within the walls of this manor. She could ask Ashford directly. The thought crossed her mind and lingered there, tempting, despite everything she had told herself about protecting her secret. But asking him for such a significant sum would require an explanation she was not yet ready to give, and she feared, even now, after everything that had passed between them regarding Cecilia, that revealing the depth of her family's poverty might change the way he saw her, might make her feel, at last, like exactly the kind of desperate, needy woman she had spent months trying not to appear to be. Instead, she made a decision that she knew, even as she made it, carried significant risk. She told Ashford she needed to visit an old family friend in a neighboring town, packed a small bag, and set out early the next morning by hired carriage, leaving behind only a brief note explaining her absence would last no more than 2 days. The journey to her family's small cottage took longer than she remembered, made worse by the anxious churning in her stomach with every mile that passed. When she finally arrived, she found her mother sitting exhausted beside Oliver's bed, her face pale with worry and lack of sleep, while Oliver himself lay pale and feverish beneath a thin blanket, his breathing shallow and labored in a way that frightened Alara more than she wanted to admit. "Alara," Margaret said, rising quickly, relief and exhaustion mixing plainly on her face. "You should not have come. What if someone discovers?" "I don't care about that right now," Alara said firmly, kneeling beside her brother's bed and taking his small, hot hand in her own. "How long has he been like this?" 3 days now, growing worse each day. Dr. Ashby has done what he can, but he says the fever is beyond anything the local remedies can treat properly." Alara spent the day arranging everything necessary, sending urgently for a physician from the city, using nearly every coin she had brought with her, and sitting beside her brother through the long hours as his fever rose and fell in worrying waves. She dabbed his forehead with cool cloths, sang the same quiet songs their mother had once sung to both of them as children, and refused to leave his side even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her completely. The city physician arrived by evening, a serious, careful man named Dr. Foss, who examined Oliver thoroughly before delivering his assessment with grave but measured words. The illness was serious, he explained, but not without hope, provided they could bring the fever down within the next 2 days and ensure Oliver received proper nourishment and rest throughout his recovery. He left careful instructions and a selection of medicines, along with a bill that consumed nearly every remaining coin Alara had brought with her. She stayed through that first night, refusing to leave despite her mother's gentle insistence that she should rest, and it was somewhere in the deep, exhausted hours before dawn that Alara finally allowed herself to cry. Quiet, careful tears that she wiped away quickly whenever her mother glanced in her direction, unwilling to add her own grief to the burden Margaret was already carrying. By the second day, Oliver's fever had begun, slowly, to break, and Alara allowed herself the first true breath of relief she had experienced since receiving her mother's letter. But her relief was short-lived, interrupted by the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel outside the small cottage, a sound far grander than anything their modest village typically saw. She knew, even before she looked out the window, exactly who had arrived. Ashford stepped down from an elegant carriage, his expression unreadable as he studied the small, humble cottage before him, clearly having followed the trail of her absence with more thoroughness than she had anticipated. Alara's heart sank as she watched him approach the door, understanding immediately that whatever careful lies she had told about visiting an old friend were about to come apart entirely. She met him at the door before he could knock, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly, as she tried to formulate some explanation that might yet preserve at least part of her secret. Ashford, she said carefully. I did not expect. Clearly, he said, his eyes moving past her to take in the modest interior of the cottage, the worn furniture, the clear signs of a family struggling against poverty that his own wife had never once mentioned. You told me you were visiting a friend. Elara began, but the words caught in her throat, unable to find their way past months of careful, protective silence. Elara. Margaret's voice came from behind her, gentle but firm. Perhaps it is time he understood the truth. Elara closed her eyes briefly, feeling the careful walls she had built over months finally begin to crumble entirely. When she opened them again, she found Ashford watching her with an expression she could not fully name, something between confusion and dawning understanding, as though pieces of a puzzle he had been quietly assembling for months were suddenly beginning to fit into place. This is my family's home, she said quietly, finally allowing the truth to surface after so long spent protecting it. My brother has been gravely ill. I came because I could not stay away, whatever risk it carried to the secret I have been keeping since before our wedding. What secret? Ashford asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected far more than he wished to say aloud. Elara took a deep breath, understanding that there was no path left except forward, into the full truth she had guarded so carefully for so many months. The debt Grimshaw mentioned, before our marriage, it was real, and it was enormous, and my family had no way to pay it. I did not marry you simply for practical reasons, in the way I allowed you to believe, Ashford. I married you because it was the only way to save my mother and brother from complete ruin. Every coin of jewelry I sold, every quiet visit I have kept from you, has gone toward keeping this family alive, while I built a new life within your walls. The silence that followed felt endless, stretching between them like a held breath neither of them dared release. Ashford's gaze moved from Elara to Margaret to the small doorway leading toward Oliver's sick room, and something in his expression shifted slowly from confusion into something far more complicated. Understanding, perhaps, mixed with something that looked almost like shame. Show me the boy, he said finally, his voice quieter than Elara had ever heard it. She led him inside without another word, her heart pounding with uncertainty about what would come next, understanding only that the careful secret she had protected for so long now belonged entirely to her husband, and that there was no way left to predict how he might choose to respond. Ashford stood quietly beside Oliver's small bed for a long moment, studying the boy's pale, fever-worn face with an expression Elara could not fully read. Oliver, still weak but conscious, looked up at the tall stranger in fine clothing, with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Are you the Duke? Oliver asked weakly. Elara's husband? I am, Ashford said, his voice gentler than Elara had ever heard it. She talks about you sometimes, in her letters to Mother, Oliver said. She never says if you're kind or not. Ashford glanced briefly at Elara, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before turning his attention back to the boy. I am learning to be, he said carefully, thanks to your sister's patience. He left the room shortly after, and Elara followed him out into the small, modest sitting area, where Margaret waited anxiously, clearly uncertain what to expect from the Duke whose reputation had traveled far beyond the borders of their small village. Ashford studied the room for a long moment, the worn furniture, the careful mending visible in the curtains, the clear signs of a family that had once known comfort and now survived on careful economy alone. Duchess, Margaret said carefully, using the formal title despite the clear tension in the room. Your Grace, I must apologize for any deception. You need not apologize, Ashford said, cutting her off gently. It seems I am the one who owes an apology, for failing to understand the true circumstances my wife has been managing alone since our marriage began. Margaret looked at him with clear surprise, and Elara felt something loosen slightly in her chest at his words, though she remained cautious, uncertain whether his calm exterior concealed anger that might surface once they were alone. I will send for my own physician to remain here until the boy has fully recovered, Ashford continued, his voice firm and businesslike now, though not unkind, and I will see that proper arrangements are made for this family's ongoing support, so that circumstances such as these need never threaten your welfare again. Your Grace, that is far too generous, Margaret began. It is simply correct, Ashford said. My wife has spent months quietly sacrificing her own comfort to protect this family, at considerable personal cost, while allowing me to believe our marriage carried no burdens beyond the ones I had already imagined. The least I can do now is ensure that burden is properly shared, as it should have been from the beginning. Alara watched this exchange with a strange mixture of relief and unease, grateful for her family's sake, but uncertain what this new understanding truly meant for the careful, guarded relationship she and Ashford had built over the past months. She did not have to wait long to find out. He asked to speak with her privately once arrangements had been made for the physician's arrival, and they walked together into the small garden behind the cottage, the cold winter air settling around them as they faced each other properly for the first time since the truth had come fully to light. "Why did you not tell me?" Ashford asked, his voice carrying more hurt than anger, which somehow felt far harder for Alara to bear. "Because I did not want you to see me as another burden," Alara said honestly. "You already believed before we married that I was marrying you for practical reasons alone. I did not want to add to that the image of a desperate woman, trading herself entirely for her family's survival, with nothing genuine to offer you beyond necessity." "And what would you call this, if not necessity?" Ashford asked, gesturing toward the modest cottage behind them. "Alara, I have watched you these past months, sacrificing your own comfort, selling your own jewelry, quietly redirecting every resource available to you toward a family in crisis, all while allowing me to believe you were simply adjusting quietly to your new life. That is not weakness. That is not something to be ashamed of hiding. It is, I think, one of the most genuinely selfless things I have witnessed in a very long time." Alara felt something catch in her throat at his words, unprepared for the depth of understanding in his voice. "I feared you would see it differently," she admitted. "I might have, once," Ashford said quietly. "Before Cecilia, I might have simply assumed the worst of any woman keeping secrets from me, regardless of her reasons. But you have shown me, again and again these past months, that you are nothing like her. I should have trusted that sooner, rather than allowing my own past to cloud my judgment of your character." They stood together in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything finally spoken settling gently between them, rather than driving them further apart, as Alara had feared it might. "I am sorry," Ashford said finally, "that I made you feel you needed to carry this burden entirely alone." "And I am sorry," Alara replied, "that I did not trust you enough to share it sooner." Something shifted then, subtle but unmistakable, a genuine warmth passing between them for the first time since their wedding day, unclouded by suspicion or careful performance. Ashford reached out, tentatively, and took her hand in his, and Alara did not pull away, allowing herself, for the first time, to believe that whatever this marriage had begun as, it might yet become something genuinely worth having. They remained at the cottage for 3 more days, until Oliver's fever broke fully, and the physician confirmed he was well on his way to a complete recovery. Ashford insisted on covering every remaining cost of care, arranged for a modest but steady allowance to be sent to Margaret each month going forward, and even spent an afternoon sitting beside Oliver's bed, listening patiently, as the boy chattered eagerly about his interest in horses and his hopes of one day working with them properly. Alara watched this unfolding warmth between her husband and her family with a quiet, growing sense of hope she had not allowed herself to feel, since long before her father's death had upended everything she once believed about her future. It was not the life she had originally imagined for herself, not the quiet happiness she had once planned to build with Edmund, but it was, perhaps, becoming something equally real. A life built not on desperate necessity alone, but on genuine understanding, genuine care, and the slow, careful building of trust between 2 people who had both been hurt deeply by circumstances beyond their control. As they finally prepared to return to Blackwood Manor, Alara found herself looking at her husband with something she had not expected to feel so soon, a warmth that went beyond simple gratitude, something closer to the beginnings of genuine affection. She did not yet know what to call it, or whether it was too soon to trust such feelings after everything that had passed between them. But she allowed herself, for the first time since her wedding day, to hope that this marriage might yet become something she had never expected. A partnership, built not on sacrifice alone, but on the possibility of genuine happiness, shared honestly between 2 people who had both learned, in their own painful ways, the true cost of hiding behind careful walls. The return to Blackwood Manor felt different than the outward journey had. the careful distance between Alara and Ashford replaced now by an easy quiet that neither of them felt the need to fill with forced conversation. But the peace they had found at the cottage did not travel with them entirely intact, and within days of their return, Alara discovered that not everyone within the manor's walls was pleased by the changes taking place. Mr. Pruitt, the steward whose decisions she had first challenged months earlier over Tommy's injured arm, had grown increasingly resentful of what he viewed as the Duchess's constant interference in matters he considered rightfully his own. Word reached Alara through Mrs. Dalton that Pruitt had been quietly complaining to other members of staff, suggesting that the new Duchess's growing influence over household affairs was inappropriate, even suggesting, in careless moments, that Ashford was being led astray by a wife whose true motives remained uncertain. Alara chose, at first, to ignore these rumblings, understanding that a man like Pruitt, having enjoyed unchecked authority for 15 years, would naturally resist any shift in the household's balance of power. But the complaints grew bolder as weeks passed, until finally, Ashford himself was forced to address the matter directly. He called Pruitt into his study one afternoon, with Alara present at his specific request, and the tension in the room was immediate and unmistakable the moment the steward entered. "I understand you have concerns about recent changes to this household," Ashford said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that left no room for misunderstanding. Pruitt's expression flickered with poorly concealed discomfort. "Your Grace, I have only ever sought to manage this household's resources responsibly, as I have done for 15 years. And yet I understand you denied medical care to an injured stable boy, on the grounds that his wages made such care an unnecessary expense," Ashford said. "And I understand you have continued to voice objections to my wife's involvement in matters of household welfare, despite my own clear instruction that her judgment on such matters is to be respected. Your Grace, with respect, the Duchess has no formal experience managing an estate of this size." "The Duchess," Ashford interrupted, his voice hardening slightly, "has shown more genuine care for the welfare of this household's staff in a few short months than you have managed to demonstrate in 15 years of service. I will not tolerate further complaints of this nature, Mr. Pruitt. You will treat my wife's decisions with the same respect you would afford my own, or you will find employment elsewhere." Pruitt's face paled slightly, understanding clearly the seriousness of the warning. "Understood, Your Grace," he said stiffly, before excusing himself from the room with as much dignity as he could manage. Once he was gone, Alara turned to Ashford with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting my judgment so completely." "You have earned that trust many times over," Ashford said simply. "It would be foolish of me not to recognize it." The matter with Pruitt settled the immediate tension within the household staff, though whispers of the confrontation spread quickly regardless, and it was not long before word of the Duchess's growing influence reached beyond the walls of Blackwood Manor entirely, into the wider gossip of county society. Alara first became aware of this when Lady Prudence arrived unannounced one afternoon, her expression carrying a mixture of concern and something closer to grudging approval. "You have become quite the topic of conversation, Duchess," she said, settling into a chair in the manor's drawing room with her usual sharp, assessing gaze. "It seems half the county believes you have somehow tamed my nephew's famously cold temperament, while the other half remains convinced you must be scheming for some hidden advantage, given how quickly his behavior has changed since your marriage." "I have schemed for nothing beyond my family's welfare," Alara said honestly. "Whatever changes people observe in Ashford, I assure you, are entirely his own doing." "Perhaps," Lady Prudence said, though her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than doubt. "Though I confess, Duchess, I did not expect this arrangement to produce anything beyond a comfortable, distant marriage of convenience. I am pleasantly surprised to find myself wrong." Alara smiled slightly at this, understanding it as close to a genuine compliment as Lady Prudence was likely to offer. "I did not expect it either," she admitted. "But I have come to believe that Ashford is a far better man than his reputation suggests, and I am grateful to have discovered that truth for myself, rather than relying on the rumors that surrounded him before our marriage. The rumors regarding Cecilia's death still persist. You understand," Lady Prudence said carefully. "Regardless of how the county's opinion of Ashford's temperament may be shifting, there remain those who continue to believe he played some role in her passing, however unfairly." Alara's expression grew serious at this. "I know the truth of what happened between them," she said quietly, And I do not believe, for even a moment, that Ashford is guilty of the cruelty people continue to accuse him of. Then perhaps, Lady Prudence said, studying her carefully, it would do this family a great deal of good if the county came to understand that truth as clearly as you do. The suggestion lingered in Alara's mind long after Lady Prudence had departed, and that evening, she raised the matter carefully with Ashford as they sat together in the library, a habit they had begun to share in the weeks since their return from her family's cottage. Your aunt believes the county's lingering suspicions about Cecilia's death continue to harm your reputation, Alara said carefully. I wonder if there might be some way to address those rumors properly, rather than allowing them to persist unchallenged. Ashford's expression grew guarded at the mention of the subject, though not as sharply closed as it once might have been. I have considered addressing it many times, he admitted, but I feared that any attempt to defend myself publicly would only appear as further evidence of guilt to those already inclined to believe the worst of me. Perhaps, Alara said gently, it is not defense that is needed, but simply the truth, offered plainly, without fear or apology. You did nothing wrong, Ashford. There is no shame in allowing people to finally understand that clearly. He considered this for a long moment, studying her with an expression that had grown steadily warmer over the weeks since their return from the cottage. Perhaps you are right, he said finally, though I confess, I would feel far more capable of facing such a conversation with you beside me, rather than alone, as I have faced so much of this burden until now. You will not have to face it alone, Alara said, reaching across to take his hand in hers, a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them in recent weeks. Whatever comes next, Ashford, we will face it together. It was, Alara realized as she said the words, the first time she had truly believed them herself, not simply as a practical arrangement born of necessity, but as a genuine promise between two people who had slowly, carefully, built something real between them, from the wreckage of circumstances neither of them had chosen. Whatever challenges remained ahead, whatever lingering suspicions or rumors still needed to be addressed, Alara understood now that she would not face them as a woman quietly sacrificing herself alone, but as a partner, standing beside a husband who had finally learned to trust her completely. Lady Prudence's suggestion took shape over the following weeks into something more formal than either Alara or Ashford had initially intended. A grand gathering at Blackwood Manor, the first the estate had hosted since long before Cecilia's death, to which every prominent family in the county would be invited. Ashford had resisted the idea at first, uncomfortable with the notion of placing himself deliberately before the very people whose whispered suspicions had shadowed him for 3 years. But Alara, with quiet persistence, helped him understand that hiding away had only ever fed those suspicions further, and that facing them openly, together, offered the only true path toward finally putting the matter to rest. The preparations consumed nearly a month, and Alara found herself, for the first time since her wedding, genuinely enjoying the work of building something within the walls of Blackwood Manor. She oversaw the careful restoration of rooms, long left unused, worked with Mrs. Dalton to plan a menu that would honor the estate's reputation without excess, and spent long evenings with Ashford discussing exactly how they might address the rumors surrounding Cecilia's death without appearing defensive or evasive. We must simply tell the truth, Alara said one evening, as they reviewed the guest list together, in the study that had once felt so cold and unwelcoming to her, and now felt like the most comfortable room in the entire manor, not as an accusation against Cecilia's memory, but simply as an honest account of what happened. People respect honesty, Ashford, even when the truth is difficult. And, if they do not believe it, regardless of how honestly it is offered, then at least you will have spoken it plainly, rather than allowing silence to continue speaking falsehoods on your behalf. Ashford considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. You have a way of making difficult things feel possible, he said quietly. I do not think I fully understood, before our marriage, how much I needed exactly that kind of steadiness in my life. The evening of the gathering arrived clear and cold, the manor's halls filled with candlelight and the low hum of conversation, as guests began arriving in a steady stream of carriages. Alara stood beside Ashford at the entrance, dressed in deep blue silk that Ashford had commissioned specifically for the occasion, and she felt, for the first time in her life, genuinely prepared to face whatever the evening might bring. The early hours passed pleasantly enough, filled with careful, polite conversation, as guests admired the restored manor and offered cautious compliments on the marriage that had, according to whispered rumor, transformed the notoriously cold Duke into something far warmer than anyone had expected. But Alara could sense, beneath the pleasant surface, the lingering curiosity that had brought so many of these guests here tonight, not simply to admire the manor, but to study the man at its center, still uncertain whether to trust the change they were witnessing. It was Lord Ellery Ashcombe, a distant cousin of Cecilia's family, who finally raised the subject directly, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of nearby guests. "It is remarkable, Your Grace, how quickly your fortunes seem to have changed since your unfortunate first marriage. One almost wonders what truly happened to the late Duchess, given how swiftly you appear to have moved forward from her passing." The room grew quiet around them, guests pretending not to listen, while clearly straining to hear every word. Alara felt Ashford's hand tighten slightly against her own, and she squeezed it gently in return, a silent reminder that he did not face this moment alone. "I understand the curiosity surrounding Cecilia's death," Ashford said, his voice calm and steady, despite the weight of every eye now turned toward him. "I have allowed that curiosity to remain unaddressed for 3 years, believing that silence was the more dignified response. I understand now that silence has only allowed false suspicions to grow unchecked." He paused, and the room remained utterly silent, waiting. "Cecilia and I were not a happy couple," he continued. "She loved another man throughout much of our marriage, a truth I discovered myself, to my great sorrow, some months before her passing. When she fell ill, I called for every physician available, and I sat beside her bed through the worst of her suffering, despite the pain her betrayal had caused me. She died of an illness no physician could properly explain, not of any harm I caused her. I have carried the weight of suspicion for 3 years, Lord Ashcombe, and I confess, I am tired of carrying it silently any longer." The silence that followed felt heavy with uncertainty, until Alara stepped forward slightly, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the gathered crowd. "I have lived in this household for many months now," she said. "I have seen firsthand the kind of man my husband truly is, patient with those who serve him, generous toward those in genuine need, and honest, even when honesty costs him comfort. I do not believe, for even a moment, the rumors that have followed him these past 3 years, and I would ask that anyone who claims to care about the truth consider carefully whether continuing to spread such rumors serves anything beyond idle curiosity." Lord Ashcombe, clearly uncomfortable with the directness of the response, offered a stiff apology before retreating quickly into the safety of the wider crowd, and slowly, gradually, the tension in the room began to ease, replaced by a quiet murmur of conversation that suggested, at last, a genuine shift in opinion among at least some of the guests present. Later that evening, as the last carriages departed and the manor grew quiet once more, Ashford found Alara standing alone in the garden, looking up at the clear winter sky above them. "Thank you," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "For tonight, for everything, truly, since the day you arrived here." "You do not need to thank me," Alara said, turning to face him. "We are partners in this now, Ashford. Whatever burdens either of us carries, we carry them together from this point forward." He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, a tenderness in the gesture that would have seemed impossible from the cold, guarded man she had married so many months earlier. "I did not expect, when this arrangement began, that I would come to feel what I feel now," he admitted quietly. "But I find myself grateful, every single day, that circumstances brought you into my life, however unconventional the beginning may have been." "As am I," Alara said softly, and for the first time since her wedding day, she allowed herself to lean into him fully, without hesitation, without the careful guardedness that had defined so much of their early marriage. Standing together beneath the winter sky, surrounded by the quiet peace of a manor finally beginning to feel like a true home, rather than simply a place of survival, Alara understood that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she and Ashford would face them, not as strangers bound by desperate circumstance, but as two people who had found, against every expectation, something genuinely worth building together. Spring arrived at Blackwood Manor with a gentleness that felt almost unfamiliar after the long, difficult winter that had preceded it, and Alara found herself, on a warm morning nearly a year after her wedding, standing in the same garden where she and Ashford had spoken so honestly beneath the winter sky, watching new flowers bloom along paths that had once felt cold and unfamiliar to her. So much had changed since that first difficult night when Grimshaw had knocked on her family's door, threatening everything she held dear. Oliver had fully recovered from his illness and now visited the manor regularly, delighting in the stables where Tommy, fully healed from his own injury, had become something of a friend and mentor in matters of horsemanship. Margaret, no longer burdened by fear of poverty, had grown steadily more at ease, visiting often enough that the servants at Blackwood Manor had come to greet her with the same warmth they showed Alara herself. The rumors surrounding Cecilia's death had not vanished entirely. Some suspicions, Alara had come to understand, lingered regardless of how plainly the truth was spoken. But the gathering at the manor had shifted opinion enough that Ashford no longer carried the weight of constant suspicion everywhere he went. And slowly, steadily, he had begun rebuilding relationships within the county that his grief and guardedness had allowed to wither over the past 3 years. Alara herself had found, within the walls of Blackwood Manor, a purpose she had never fully expected when she first agreed to this marriage of desperate necessity. She had taken on greater responsibility for the household's welfare, working closely alongside Mrs. Dalton to ensure every member of staff was treated with genuine fairness and care, and had even begun quiet work supporting families in the surrounding village who faced hardships similar to what her own family had once endured, using her position not for personal comfort alone, but for genuine good within the community she now called home. "You are thinking very deeply about something," Ashford said, coming to stand beside her in the garden, his voice carrying the same warmth that had grown steadily between them over the past year. "I am thinking about how much has changed," Alara said, smiling as she turned to face him. "A year ago, I stood in this garden, believing I had sacrificed my entire future to save my family. I never imagined I would find something so genuinely good, waiting for me here as well." Ashford took her hand gently in his own, the gesture as natural now as breathing, nothing like the formal, distant courtesy that had marked their earliest days together. "I have thought often, this past year, about how differently things might have unfolded," he admitted, "if I had allowed my own guardedness to keep us as distant strangers, as I fully expected our marriage to remain when we first agreed to this arrangement." "But you didn't," Alara said softly. "You allowed yourself to trust again, despite everything Cecilia's betrayal had taught you to fear." "Because you gave me reason to trust," Ashford said. "Every single day, in ways both large and small, you have shown me exactly the kind of woman you truly are. Not the desperate, calculating wife I once feared marrying, but someone genuinely selfless, genuinely kind, and genuinely worthy of far more happiness than the circumstances of our marriage first offered you." Alara felt tears gather in her eyes, though they were tears of genuine joy rather than the quiet grief she had carried through so much of the past year. "I did not marry you for love, Ashford," she said honestly. "I want you to know that I understand how strange that beginning was, how little either of us had reason to expect anything genuine to grow from it." "And now?" Ashford asked gently, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer she was about to give. "And now," Alara said, "I find that I love you completely, not because circumstance forced us together, but because of everything I have watched you become, and everything we have built together since that difficult beginning." Ashford's expression softened into something Alara had never seen from him before, a genuine, unguarded joy that transformed his features entirely, erasing every trace of the cold, distant man she had first married. "I love you as well," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He no longer felt any need to hide, more completely than I believed myself capable of loving anyone, after everything Cecilia's betrayal taught me to fear. He drew her into his arms then, and Alara allowed herself, fully and completely, to simply exist within the warmth of a marriage that had begun as nothing more than a desperate arrangement to save her family, and had grown, through patience and honesty and genuine care, into something neither of them had dared to hope for when they first stood together at that small, quiet wedding a year earlier. Later that evening, as they sat together in the library that had become their favorite shared space within the manor, Ashford took her hand once more, his expression turning thoughtful. "I have been considering something," he said. "A proper celebration, this time, not the small, businesslike ceremony that marked our original wedding. A renewal of our vows, perhaps, spoken not out of necessity, but out of genuine love and choice. I would like that very much, Alara said, smiling warmly at the suggestion. And I would like your family present properly this time, Ashford continued, not simply as witnesses to an arrangement, but as genuine celebrants of a marriage we have both chosen freely, regardless of how it began. Alara leaned forward and kissed him gently, a gesture that had grown as natural between them as any other expression of the genuine affection they had built together. Thank you, she said softly, for everything you have become, and for everything we have built together, despite the difficult circumstances that first brought us together. Thank you, Ashford replied, for never allowing me to remain the cold, gordated man I had become before you arrived, and for showing me, patiently and completely, exactly what genuine partnership could look like when built on honesty rather than fear. Outside the library windows, the spring evening settled gently over Blackwood Manor, the gardens blooming with new life after the long winter that had preceded them, much like the marriage that had grown, slowly and carefully, from a desperate act of sacrifice into something genuinely beautiful. Alara Whitmore, once a young woman who had believed she was giving up her entire future to save her family, had found instead a life richer and more genuinely happy than anything she had once imagined possible, built not on the ruins of sacrifice alone, but on the patient, careful work of two people who had chosen, again and again, to trust each other completely, regardless of how difficult that trust had once seemed to earn. And as she sat beside her husband in the warm glow of the library's candlelight, Alara understood, finally and completely, that some of life's greatest joys arrive not through the paths we originally choose for ourselves, but through the quiet, patient courage to build something genuine from whatever circumstances life happens to place before us.